The Duke of Carlo did not look like a man who had come to ruin a woman's life. He looked, Martha thought, like a man who measured the world in straight lines and hard facts. He stood in the center of her late husband's kitchen, a space that smelled of boiled cabbage and old stone, and held the warrant as if it were a surveyor's tool. His coat was black, severe, and cut to the unforgiving lines of his shoulders. His face was all angles, a study in granite and shadow, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. They certainly did not miss the faint, violet smudges that circled her wrists, just visible where the cuffs of her morning dress had ridden up as she'd been scrubbing a pot. He had come with a local constable, a stout, nervous man who now stood shifting his weight by the door, his gaze fixed determinedly on the floorstones. The warrant was for her arrest. For the murder of Lord Graves, the Duke's gaze lifted from the paper, traveled the length of her plain gray dress, and settled on her face. She met his stare without flinching. Fear was a useless luxury, one her husband had long ago beaten out of her. What remained was a kind of weary stillness, a brittle calm that had served her well these past 5 years. "Mrs. Graves," the Duke said. His voice was low and resonant, a sound that seemed to carry its own gravity. It was not a voice for pleasantries or condolences. It was a voice for pronouncements. "I am the Duke of Carlo. This is a warrant for your person, to be delivered to the magistrate in Ashford on suspicion of causing the death of your husband, Lord Julian Graves." He did not read it with any particular relish or regret. He stated it as a fact, like announcing the time or the weather. Martha simply nodded, placing the damp cloth she held onto the edge of the stone sink. She had been expecting this. Ever since her husband's cousin, Elias, had arrived with his feigned sympathy and his sharp, acquisitive eyes, she had known this was coming. He wanted the estate, and she was the only impediment. A murder charge was the most efficient way to remove her. "I see," she said, her own voice quiet but clear in the cavernous kitchen. She began to untie her apron. The Duke's eyes followed the movement, then flickered back to her wrists. He was a precise man, the world whispered, a man who had built a fortune on shipping and industry by calculating every risk, every variable. He was called the Iron Duke, not for his title, but for his will, and an iron will could not abide an equation that did not balance. The warrant in his hand was a simple, brutal piece of arithmetic. A cruel husband dead at the bottom of the stairs, a young wife with no love for him, a convenient inheritance. It should have been a clean sum. But the Bruises were an anomaly. They were a variable he had not accounted for. They spoke of a different kind of story, one of violence and submission, not of a wife's sudden, murderous rage. He saw the way she held herself, her spine straight, her chin level. There was no hysteria, no pleading, just a profound, almost unnerving acceptance. He took a step forward, his polished boots silent on the stone. He did not look at the constable. He looked only at her. "Constable," the Duke said, his voice dropping half a tone, yet gaining in authority. "Wait outside in the carriage." The constable looked up, startled, then nodded quickly, and practically fled the room. They were alone. The silence that fell was heavy, charged with the unsaid. Martha finished untying her apron and folded it neatly, placing it on the scrubbed pine of the kitchen table. It was a small, defiant act of order in the face of chaos. The Duke watched her hands. He saw they were trembling just slightly. "Show me your arms, Mrs. Graves," he commanded. It was not a request. She hesitated for only a second, before she pushed up her sleeves. The story was there, written on her skin in a tapestry of faded yellows and angry purples, old hurts and new ones, a narrative of casual, repeated cruelty. The Duke's jaw tightened, a subtle shift of muscle in that stone-carved face. The equation was now impossibly complex. The warrant in his hand felt flimsy, an accusation written on cheap paper, while the evidence before him was written on human flesh. He did not lower the warrant, but he did not raise it either. He simply stood there, a man of facts confronted with a truth that defied them, and the cold kitchen air crackled with the force of his mind rearranging the world to fit this new, terrible data. He said nothing for a full minute. Then, "Tell me what happened." Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and unexpected alliances. We love hearing from you, so let us know in the comments where you're watching from as our story begins. Lord Julian Graves had purchased Martha as one might purchase a promising mare. Her father, a country baronet with a failing estate and too many daughters, had accepted Julian's offer without the pretense of romance. The contract was signed in her father's damp, chilly study, the scent of mildew mingling with the ink. Martha had stood by the window, watching a listless rain fall on the overgrown lawns, and understood that her life was no longer her own. She was 24 now, but she had been 19 then, and still possessed a flicker of hope that kindness might be found even in a transactional marriage. That hope had been extinguished within the first week. Lord Graves was not a man of grand, theatrical cruelty. His was a more intimate, soul-crushing sort. It lived in the casual dismissal of her opinions, the way he would praise the housekeeper for a well-run dinner she had planned, the quiet contempt in his eyes when she spoke in company. He enjoyed her intelligence best when he could take credit for it. She had a mind for numbers, a clear, logical way of seeing the world that her father had dismissed as unladylike. She soon discovered that the Graves estate, for all its grandeur, was bleeding money through mismanagement and neglect. Quietly, without seeking permission, she began to study the ledgers in the estate office at night. She found duplicate payments to suppliers, bloated invoices from merchants in London, entire tenant farms left fallow. Over months, she worked in secret, creating her own set of books, a true accounting of the estate's health. She would leave anonymous notes for the steward, suggesting a supplier to be reviewed or a contract to be renegotiated. The steward, a man named Fletcher who was either lazy or complicit, would follow the suggestions. And slowly, the estate's finances began to stabilize. Lord Graves noticed only that his accounts were healthier. He boasted to his friends of his own shrewd management. Martha never said a word. Her only ally in the cold, sprawling house was a young maid named Sarah, a girl with kind eyes and a gift for comfortable silence. It was Sarah who would bring her a cup of tea late at night in the office, who would notice a new bruise forming on Martha's arm and place a pot of arnica salve on her dressing table without comment. The violence was like the financial mismanagement, petty, constant, and meant to diminish her. A hand that gripped her arm too tightly when she was slow to respond, a shove against a doorframe for a misspoken word, his signet ring brought down sharply on her knuckles for an accounting error he had made. He never struck her face. He was too concerned with appearances for that. He needed his wife to look serene and content at the dinner table, a testament to his own benign authority. The night he died had begun like any other. He had been drinking heavily, his mood turning from sullen to volatile. He was enraged over a letter from London, the contents of which he did not share. He paced the drawing room, his voice a low growl, blaming her for the dust on the mantelpiece, the chill in the room, the imagined insolence of her silence. She stood perfectly still, a technique she had perfected, waiting for the storm to pass. But it did not pass. He had backhanded her, not for the first time, but with a force that sent her stumbling back against a heavy oak sideboard. The pain was a sharp, blinding flash. She tasted blood. He lunged for her again, his face contorted, but his movements were clumsy with wine. His foot caught on the edge of a Persian rug, and he fell. He fell backward, out of the drawing room and into the great hall, his momentum carrying him over the low balustrade of the main staircase. The sound was not one she would ever forget, a sickening series of impacts, followed by a final, decisive crack that echoed in the sudden, profound silence. For a moment, she did not move, her hand pressed to her bleeding lip, her ears ringing. The silence was absolute. It was the first time the house had been truly quiet in 5 years. She walked slowly, mechanically, out of the drawing room and looked down. He lay at the bottom of the marble stairs, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm flung out as if reaching for something. His eyes were open, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, seeing nothing. She did not scream. She did not weep. She felt a vast, terrifying emptiness, a hollowed-out space where fear had lived for so long. She turned and walked to the bell pull, summoning the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. Her movements were calm, her voice steady as she gave the instructions to send for the doctor. Later, when the doctor had come and gone, pronouncing Lord Graves dead from a broken neck, his cousin arrived. Elias Thorne. He swept into the house with a flurry of performative grief, his arms enveloping Martha in a hug she did not return. His eyes, however, were not grieving. They were scanning the hall, the furniture, the paintings, as if taking inventory. "My poor, dear Martha," he had murmured, his voice thick with false sympathy. "To be left all alone. But do not worry. I will take care of everything." And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would. He had spent the next 2 days speaking in hushed tones to the staff, to the doctor, to the constable in the village, planting the seeds of a story. A volatile husband, yes, but a cold, unhappy wife. An argument. A fall that was perhaps not an accident. He was methodical. By the time the Duke of Carlo's carriage had rolled up the gravel drive, Elias had built his case, and Martha was already a condemned woman in the court of local opinion. She had been waiting in the kitchen, the one room in the house that felt honest, when the knock came. She had been scrubbing a pot with a furious, focused energy, the simple physical task a small anchor in the swirling chaos. She had known who it would be. She had been prepared for the constable, for the cell, for the magistrate. She had not been prepared for the Duke, or for the piercing, analytical gaze that saw more than just a convenient suspect. She had not been prepared for a man who refused to accept a simple answer when a more complicated truth was written on her skin. Back in the present, in the cold air of the kitchen, the Duke finally lowered the warrant, placing it on the table beside her neatly folded apron. The gesture was momentous. He was setting aside the official story. "The constable believes you pushed him," he stated, his eyes locked on hers. "Mr. Thorne has been most persuasive in his account of your unhappy marriage." Martha pulled her sleeves back down, covering the evidence. "Mr. Thorne wishes to inherit this house. My conviction would be most convenient for him." Her voice was level, devoid of self-pity. The Duke considered this. It was a logical motive. It fit the numbers. "And your husband's fall?" he asked. "Was it as convenient for you, Mrs. Graves?" She met his gaze directly, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the fire that her husband had tried so hard to extinguish. His death was a release, Your Grace. That is the truth. But I did not kill him. I simply did not mourn him when he fell. The honesty of it struck him. It was stark and unadorned, and he found he believed her. He gestured to the chair at the kitchen table. "Sit," he said. Then he walked to the door and spoke to one of his own men who had been waiting in the hall. "Bring our bags in. We will be staying." He returned to the kitchen and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I am not here on behalf of the Crown, Mrs. Graves. I am here because your husband owed me a great deal of money, a debt his estate is now responsible for." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The magistrate can have you tomorrow, or the next day. For now you are a guest in your own home, under my protection. And you and I are going to examine Lord Graves's accounts. Every last ledger, every last letter. You will help me find my money, and in doing so, we may perhaps find the truth of your husband's death. Those are the terms." It was not an offer of kindness. It was a contract, as cold and clear as the one her father had signed. He would provide safety from the gallows. He required her mind, her knowledge of the estate. He would not offer sympathy or companionship. There would be no sentiment between them. Martha looked from the warrant on the table to the formidable man standing before her. Cold indifference, she thought, was survivable. It was a language she understood. It was certainly better than the active, intimate cruelty she had known for 5 years. "I accept your terms, Your Grace," she said. And in the silent, cavernous house, a strange and unsettling partnership began. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. The Duke, she learned his name was Alistair, established his presence in the house with an authority that was absolute yet unobtrusive. He dismissed the local constable with a quiet word, informing him that Mrs. Graves was under his personal wardship pending a private investigation into the estate's finances. The Duke's own men, two quiet, imposing figures, stood guard at the main doors, effectively sealing the estate off from the outside world, and more importantly, from Elias Thorne. The household staff watched the new arrangement with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, maintained a posture of stiff disapproval, her lips permanently pursed. She had been loyal to Lord Graves, or at least to the position he represented, and she clearly viewed Martha as a usurper and now a murderer. The steward, Fletcher, was visibly unnerved by the Duke's presence, his usual blustering incompetence replaced by a sweating panic whenever Carlo directed a question his way. Only Sarah, the young maid, remained a small beacon of warmth. She would bring Martha's meals to the study where she now spent her days, offering a small, encouraging smile that spoke volumes. The study became their world. It was a dark, paneled room, dominated by a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to her husband. By silent, mutual agreement, they did not use it. Instead, a long library table was cleared, and they worked at opposite ends. Two solitary figures lit by the glow of oil lamps as the autumn evenings drew in. The Duke had boxes of Lord Graves's papers brought from his office, from storage, from every corner of the house. He was methodical, relentless. He worked with a focused intensity that Martha found strangely familiar. It was the same concentration she applied to her ledgers. He spoke little, but his questions were precise. "Who is this supplier in Bristol? Why was this tenant's rent forgiven for 3 consecutive years? Explain this payment to a jeweler in London. There is no corresponding receipt for any jewelry." Martha, with her secret set of books and her intimate knowledge of the estate's workings, answered each question clearly and concisely. She would pull out her own ledger, open it to the relevant page, and explain the discrepancy. "The Bristol supplier is a fiction, Your Grace. The invoices are fabricated. The payments were funneled back to Mr. Fletcher, the steward." Or, "That tenant is a distant cousin of Lord Graves. The forgiven rent was a private arrangement." Or, "The payment to the jeweler was for a pearl necklace. It was not for me. I believe he had a mistress in the city." The Duke would listen, his gaze fixed on her face, and then make a neat, precise note in his own book. He never praised her, but she began to see a grudging respect in his eyes. He had expected a frightened widow or a cunning killer. He had not expected a partner in his investigation. He started leaving a cup of coffee for her on the table when he knew she would be working late. She, in turn, began to organize the chaotic piles of paper into a logical system that he could navigate more easily. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the accounts, but in the shared silence of the study, a strange sort of cohabitation took root. He would watch her from his end of the table, the lamplight catching the auburn glints in her brown hair as she bent over a ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the intelligence he had suspected, but also a resilience that astonished him. She never complained. She never spoke of her husband's cruelty, beyond the factual statements required by his questions. The bruises on her arms had begun to fade, but he found he could not forget them. One evening, she found him in the library, a room she had always avoided as it was her husband's favorite. He was not reading, but standing before the cold fireplace, staring into the empty grate. He seemed different, the iron control he usually maintained showing the faintest of cracks. He looked weary. "You should not be in here," he said, his voice rough. This was his room. "It is a room in my house, Your Grace," she replied quietly, stopping by the doorway. "And you are in it." He turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes beyond calculation and control. It looked like a deep, old pain. He seemed about to say something, but the moment passed. The mask of the Iron Duke slipped back into place. "The ledgers for 1868 are missing," he said, his voice once again crisp and businesslike. "Fletcher claims he cannot find them." "I have them," Martha said. "I keep the most important records in my rooms, for safekeeping." He simply nodded, the unspoken truth of what she was keeping them safe from hanging in the air between them. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice so low she almost missed it. "Alistair." She paused. "My name is Alistair." It was the first crack in the transactional wall between them, a small, personal detail offered in the quiet of a lonely night. She did not reply, but as she walked back to the study, she felt the ground shift ever so slightly beneath her feet. It was nearly a week into their strange, cloistered existence when Martha found it. She was working her way through a dusty crate of papers from the attic, documents that even her husband had likely forgotten. Most of it was mundane, old deeds, expired contracts, receipts for long-dead horses. But at the very bottom of the crate, tucked inside a slim, leather-bound folio, was a private ledger. It was not like the official estate books. The handwriting was her husband's, but it was small and furtive. The entries were cryptic, recorded with dates and initials, followed by sums of money. These were not business transactions. As she scanned the pages, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. These were records of blackmail. Lord Graves had been extorting people for years, The entries spanned a decade. J.P. followed by a payment of £500, Lady M, and 1,000. Then she saw it. An entry from 8 years prior, larger than the rest. The initials were A.C., and the sum was a staggering £5,000. Beside it, in the margins, was a single, hastily scrawled word, Carlo. Her breath caught. Alistair. A C, the Duke of Carlo. This was not just a debt he had come to collect. This was something older, darker. She felt a wave of dizziness. Had his arrival been a lie? Was his protection merely a pretense to gain access to the house? To these very papers? The trust she had cautiously, unconsciously begun to build crumbled into dust. The shared silence of the study, the cups of coffee, the quiet respect. Had it all been a calculated performance? She felt a fool. Of course it was. He was the Iron Duke, a ruthless man of industry. He would use any tool at his disposal to achieve his ends. And she, a desperate widow accused of murder, was a very effective tool. She sat there for a long time, the ledger open on her lap, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The careful order of her world, which she had fought so hard to maintain, was once again thrown into chaos. She had to know the truth. That evening, she waited until the house was asleep. She found him, as she knew she would, in the library. A fire was lit in the grate now, casting flickering shadows across the tall bookshelves. He was seated in a large leather armchair, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. She walked directly to the center of the room, the small ledger held tightly in her hand. She did not speak, but placed it on the table beside his chair, open to the damning page. He glanced down. His body went rigid, the only sign of his shock the sudden tightening of his grip on the glass. He looked from the book to her face, the silence stretched, thick with accusation. "What is your true purpose here, Your Grace?" Martha's voice was quiet, but it was as sharp and cold as ice. "Was it ever about a debt? Or did you come here to reclaim this?" He did not answer immediately. He set his glass down with a precise, deliberate motion, then rose from his chair. He was a tall man, and he seemed to fill the room, his shadow dancing on the walls. She did not back away. "You believe I deceived you?" he said. It was not a question. "I believe you are a man who does what is necessary to achieve his goals," she replied, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve. "I believe you saw my predicament as an opportunity." He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. The firelight carved harsh lines into his face. "When I first heard of Graves's death, my intention was simple. I came to secure my family's secret and, if I am to be honest, to watch the man who tormented my family finally lose everything, even in death. I intended to use his debt as leverage to find what I was looking for. That is the truth." His honesty was disarming, but she held her ground. "And me?" she asked. "What was I in your plan? A pawn? A complication?" "You," he said, his voice dropping, becoming rough with an emotion she could not name, "were the variable I did not account for. I came seeking vengeance against a ghost. I found a living woman in his place, bearing his marks. I saw the warrant, and I saw your arms. The two things did not belong in the same world. It changed my calculations." He gestured to the ledger. "That money was paid to protect my younger sister. Graves discovered a series of foolish, youthful letters she had written to an unsuitable man. He threatened to publish them, to ruin her name and her marriage prospects. My father paid him." It nearly beggared our family, but it kept her safe. I was a younger son then, with no power to challenge him. A story of shame, of helplessness. It was a vulnerability she had never imagined the Duke of Carlo could possess. The wall of iron around him seemed to fissure, revealing the man within. The crisis of trust was not resolved, but it had transformed. It was no longer about his deception, but about a shared enemy, a shared history of pain at the hands of the same cruel man. She looked from his face, etched with the memory of an old wound, to the ledger on the table. The numbers were no longer just figures. They were ghosts of past cruelties. The uneasy truce forged in the library was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of Elias Thorne. He did not come alone. He was accompanied by a London solicitor, a man with a face like a closed fist and a briefcase full of legal documents. They were shown into the grand entrance hall, where Martha and the Duke met them. Elias's face was a perfect mask of concerned sorrow, but his eyes glittered with triumph. "Martha, my dear," he said, stepping forward as if to take her hands. "I have been so worried, kept from you in your own home by this arrangement." He gestured dismissively towards the Duke. "It is not appropriate. A woman in your delicate situation, alone with a man of the Duke's reputation." Martha instinctively stepped back, moving closer to Alistair's side. "I am quite safe, Elias," she said, her voice steady. The solicitor stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Thorne is the sole heir to this estate, as stipulated in his cousin's will. He is here to take possession of his property. He has also secured an order from the magistrate, requiring that you, Mrs. Graves, be remanded to the county jail until your formal arraignment." He held out the paper. It was official. It was legal. All the power was on their side. Elias's plan was brutally simple. Isolate Martha, remove the Duke's influence, and let the slow, grinding machinery of the law do the rest. Without access to the estate's papers, without the Duke's protection, her case would be hopeless. Alistair did not even glance at the document. His attention was fixed on Elias Thorne. "You will not be taking possession of this house," the Duke said, his voice quiet but carrying the chilling weight of command. "And you will not be removing Mrs. Graves." The solicitor puffed out his chest. "On what authority do you make such a claim, Your Grace? The law is quite clear." "The law," Alistair replied, a dangerous silkiness in his tone, "is also quite clear about the collection of outstanding debts. Lord Graves owed me a sum that far exceeds the current liquid value of this estate. As his primary creditor, I have filed a lien against all properties and assets. Nothing will be transferred or disposed of until my debt is settled. This house and everything in it is under my temporary administration." The solicitor's jaw dropped. It was a masterful move, using the cold logic of finance to build a fortress around her. Elias's mask of concern began to slip, his frustration showing in the tightening of his lips. "This is an outrage! You are interfering with justice!" "On the contrary," the Duke said smoothly, "I am preserving the assets of the estate to ensure all obligations are met, including, I might add, any potential fines or restitutions levied by the Crown. It would be most irresponsible to allow the property to change hands at such a delicate time." He was using the very accusation against Martha as a shield to protect her. Elias, seeing his legal avenue blocked, turned his venom on Martha. "You see what you have done?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You have brought this vulture down upon us. Hiding behind him will not save you. Everyone knows you killed him. A jury will see it in your cold, unfeeling face. For a moment, the old fear, the instinct to retreat and endure, rose in Martha. She felt the eyes of the staff, who were watching from the gallery above. She felt the weight of their judgment. Then she felt Alistair's presence beside her, a solid, unshakable wall. She looked directly at Elias, not at the Duke, and she found her voice. It was not loud, but it was clear and resonant in the cavernous hall. Lord Graves died because he was a drunken, reckless man who stumbled on a rug. You know this to be true, Elias. You are the only vulture in this house. You are not welcome here. Please leave. The directness of it stunned Thorne into silence. He had expected tears, hysteria, a crumbling defense. He had not expected this calm, steel-spined woman who named him for what he was. The Duke watched her, a flicker of something that looked like pride in his winter sky eyes. He had given her a fortress of law, but she had built her own, right there in the open, with nothing but the truth. Elias Thorne stared at her, his face a mask of fury. He saw he was defeated, for now. "You will hang for this," he spat, the veneer of civility gone completely. He turned on his heel, the solicitor scurrying after him, and they left, the great oak door closing behind them with a resounding boom. The confrontation was over. Martha stood, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her head was held high. She had not been rescued. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and faced the threat herself. And beside her, the Iron Duke stood as her silent, unwavering ally. That night, the house was quieter than ever, as if holding its breath after the day's confrontation. Martha could not settle. The echo of Elias's threat, "You will hang for this," circled in her mind. She had been brave in the moment, but now, alone, the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She found herself drawn to the library, to the fire, to the one place in the house that had become a shared territory. He was there, as she had suspected he might be. He was not reading or drinking, but standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit, frost-covered lawn. He turned as she entered, his face shadowed and unreadable. "I could not sleep," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "Nor I," he replied. She walked towards the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth, though the chill she felt was deep inside her. "Thank you," she said, looking into the flames, "for what you did today, for the lean. It was clever." "It was a necessary tactic," he said, his voice neutral. He came to stand near the fireplace, though he kept a careful distance. "Thorne will not give up so easily. He will petition the magistrate directly." "I know." The silence returned, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. The carefully constructed walls of their transactional arrangement seemed to be dissolving in the warm, flickering light. There were no ledgers between them now, no talk of debts or contracts. There was only the shared danger, and the memory of her voice ringing out in the hall. "When you spoke to him," Alistair said, his voice low and rough, "you sounded like a queen defending her borders." She gave a small, sad smile. "This house has been my prison, Your Grace. It is a strange thing to feel the need to defend it." "Alistair," he corrected her softly. "My name is Alistair." He paused, and when he spoke again, the carefully maintained distance in his voice was gone, replaced by a raw honesty that made her look up at him. "My initial motive for coming here was not noble, Martha. It was a cold, hard thing. Graves ruined more than my family's finances. The scandal he threatened to unleash upon my sister, it broke something in her. She was never the same. I hated him for it. I have hated him for 8 years. I came here to see his world dismantled, to pick over the bones of his estate and satisfy a long-held need for revenge. His confession hung in the air, stark and unadorned. It was the truth she had suspected, the truth that had caused the crisis of trust between them. But hearing it now, spoken with such pain, it felt different. I came seeking a monster's legacy, he continued, his eyes locked on hers. And I found you instead. I saw what he did to you, and my desire for vengeance soured. It became something else, a need for justice, for a proper accounting. He took a tentative step closer. The air between them felt charged, alive. All the unspoken thoughts, all the shared silences of the past weeks seemed to culminate in this single moment. He had seen her competence, her resilience, her quiet dignity. She had seen the damaged, honorable man beneath the iron facade. He was a monster, Alistair said, his voice thick with a lifetime of restrained emotion. I knew the fact of it. I did not understand the shape of it until I saw his mark on you. He slowly, hesitantly, reached out his hand. It was not a gesture of passion, but one of profound, aching tenderness. He did not touch her arm where the bruises had been. He gently took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong, and they curled around hers, holding on as if she were an anchor in a storm. The simple contact was devastating. It was the first kind touch she had received in 5 years. A wall inside her that she had not even known was there. A wall built of fear and loneliness and quiet endurance, finally crumbled into dust. She did not pull away. She simply stood there, her hand in his, and let the warmth of his grasp seep into her, a silent acknowledgement of all they had both suffered, and all they had now found in this most unlikely of alliances. The Iron Duke's defenses had fallen, not in a grand battle, but in a quiet library, with a simple, honest confession and the gentle taking of a hand. The magistrate's inquest was held not in a grand courtroom, but in the Ashford Town Hall, a drafty, wood-paneled room crowded with the curious and the judgmental. The air was thick with whispers. Martha walked in with Alistair at her side, her head held high, though she could feel the weight of 100 hostile stares. She wore a simple dress of dark blue, a color of quiet defiance against the black of mourning. Elias Thorne was already there, seated with his solicitor, looking confident and aggrieved. The magistrate, a stern-faced man named Mr. Davies, called the proceedings to order. Elias presented his case first. He spoke of his cousin's volatile temper, but painted it as the blustering of a troubled man, not the violence of an abuser. He described Martha as cold, aloof, and unhappy in her marriage. He produced a servant, a footman loyal to him, who testified to hearing a loud argument between Lord and Lady Graves on the night of the death, followed by a woman's shriek and then the sound of the fall. It was a lie, cleverly constructed and delivered with convincing fear. By the time he finished, the room was murmuring with conviction. Martha felt a chill of despair. It was all so plausible. Then it was Alistair's turn. He did not address the magistrate as a supplicant, but as an equal. "Mr. Davies," he began, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the whispers. "We are here to discuss a fall, but the more pressing matter, I believe, is one of finances. The finances of the deceased, and the finances of the man who stands to inherit. Mr. Elias Thorne." He produced a ledger, Martha's ledger. With methodical precision, he walked the magistrate through the estate's accounts, showing its slow recovery from near bankruptcy over the past few years, a recovery that began long before Lord Graves's death. Then he produced another set of documents. Records from banks in London. He detailed Elias Thorne's own catastrophic finances, gambling debts, failed investments, loans called due. Mr. Thorne was a desperate man, Alistair stated, his voice ringing with authority. He stood to inherit a fortune, but his cousin, Lord Graves, was in his 40s and in reasonable health. Mr. Thorne could not afford to wait for nature to take its course. He then produced his final, damning piece of evidence, a record of a large payment made by Thorne 2 weeks before the murder to a known apothecary in a shady district of London, a man with a reputation for selling discreet and untraceable poisons. The coroner's report noted a fall, Alistair said, his eyes locking on Thorne. But it did not test for the effects of a fast-acting paralytic agent, one that might cause a man, even a drunk man, to lose his footing so completely. An agent that becomes undetectable in the blood within hours. A collective gasp went through the room. Elias Thorne leaped to his feet, his face pale and sweating. "This is preposterous! Slander!" The magistrate looked at the papers, then at Thorne, his expression hardening. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne." He then turned to Martha. "Mrs. Graves, do you have anything to say?" This was her moment. Alistair had built the cage. She had to be the one to spring the trap. She stood, her hands clasped before her, and looked directly at the magistrate. She did not speak of the ledgers or the poison. She spoke of her life. In a quiet, factual voice, she described her husband's cruelty. She did not weep or raise her voice. She simply stated the facts of her marriage, detailing the isolation, the contempt, the casual violence, holding up her arms to show the faded bruises. "I did not push my husband, Mr. Davies," she concluded, her voice gaining strength. "I did not have to. His life of excess and cruelty did the work for me. I am guilty only of not grieving his death." Mr. Thorne, however, grieved the fact that he was still alive. The room was utterly silent. Her calm dignity, combined with the Duke's cold, hard evidence, was irrefutable. The story shifted. She was no longer a cold murderess. She was a survivor. Elias Thorne was no longer a grieving cousin. He was a greedy killer. The magistrate stared at Thorne for a long moment, then slammed his gavel down. "The charges against Mrs. Graves are dismissed. Constable, take Mr. Thorne into custody on suspicion of the murder of Lord Julian Graves." Chaos erupted. As the constable led a sputtering, protesting Elias Thorne away, the crowd parted for Martha and Alistair. The faces that had been hostile were now filled with a mixture of pity and awe. They walked out of the town hall and into the crisp autumn air, free. The sun was bright. Alistair stopped and looked at her, his severe face softened by a relief so profound it was almost tangible. He did not congratulate her. He simply said, "You have your name back, Martha." And in that moment, she knew she had gained far more than that. She had found her voice, her strength, and the unwavering support of the one man who had looked past the accusation to see the truth. 3 months later, the first snowdrops were pushing their way through the cold earth in the gardens of Graves Manor. The name felt wrong now. It was her home, and the ghost of its former master had finally faded. The gardens, long neglected under Lord Graves's tenure, were the focus of Martha's attention. She spent her mornings there with the elderly head gardener, planning, clearing, and coaxing life back into the dormant flower beds. It was quiet, healing work. The legal matters were settled. Elias Thorne had confessed, his nerve breaking under the weight of the evidence against him. The estate was now legally Martha's, the Duke's lien having been satisfied not with money, but with the justice he had sought. He had returned to London after the inquest, and the house had felt unnervingly empty without his solid, quiet presence. They had exchanged letters, brief, formal notes about remaining estate business, but beneath the polite words, an unspoken current flowed between them. One crisp March afternoon, she was staking a climbing rose against a crumbling stone wall when she heard the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. A familiar sense of anticipation, one she had refused to name, fluttered in her chest. She turned, and there he was. Alistair. He was walking towards her across the lawn, dressed not in the severe black she remembered, but in a simple country tweed coat. He looked younger, the harsh lines around his eyes softened. He stopped before her, his gaze taking in the garden, the signs of new growth, and her, with dirt on her hands and a smudge on her cheek. "The garden is looking better," he said, his voice the same low, resonant sound she remembered so well. "It is a work in progress," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "Like its mistress." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand one another. "I did not come about the estate," he said finally. "All of our business is concluded." "Then why did you come, Alistair?" she asked softly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He did not hand it to her. "I came to offer you a new contract, Martha." His expression was serious, almost vulnerable. "The terms are different this time. It is a contract for a full partnership, for shared breakfasts and late nights in the library, reading this time, not working. For walks in a garden we restore together, for a lifetime of honest conversation." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "The contract offers no guarantee of safety from the world, but it offers my unwavering alliance. It offers my respect, which you have earned 10 times over, and it offers my love, which I give to you freely and completely." He had said it, plainly, without poetry or preamble, in the same factual register he used for truths he was certain of. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so profound it was painful. "And what does this contract require of me?" she whispered. "It requires," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "that you say yes." She did not need to speak. She simply stepped forward into his arms and laid her head against his chest. He held her, his arms strong and sure around her. They stood there for a long time in the middle of the waking garden, two people who had found each other in the wreckage of a miserable life. What had begun as a cold transaction had become real. What was broken had become whole. And what was once a prison had, against all odds, finally become a home. "Thank you for being with us through Martha's journey. Would you have trusted the Duke in her position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from." In the end, the best alliances often begin as the most honest transactions.